Hello, I'd like to welcome you all to PSY222. It's our developmental psychology course, lifespan developmental psychology course at SUNY SCCC. At our college, it's PSY222. If you take it at another college, it probably has a different number, but we'll have an overwhelmingly similar content. I'll be your guide for the course. Professor Kim M. Sherman, usually go when I teach live, Professor S. I'll mention that I rarely narrate the slides with a picture. When I consulted SUNY, the IT people, they said it uses a tremendous amount of memory when the visual is done, and it greatly slows downloading. So I just wanted to include my picture, my live face, basically live person, in one slide so you know what the person behind the voice is. But for the rest of the slide, you'll be clicking the listening icon, and that's it. So welcome, and let's get started. This is where you should probably begin taking notes. Take notes in this course in the same manner that you would take it in a face-to-face class, assuming you take good notes in a face-to-face class. It will not be sufficient to do well in the course, or perhaps not even pass it, if you don't listen to the narrations. So copy information in your notebook, or maybe directly on slides that you've printed out. Definitely put the summary points from the narrations, and you'll be off and running. Students often ask if they should take notes on the text. I do actually touch on that question in the syllabus, but just in case you missed it, no, you do not need to take notes on the text. Really answer the text questions for each quiz, and definitely verify your answers before you click submit. That way you should get near 100%. The only questions that I will take directly from the text will appear on your text quizzes. So yes, you'll have to know and study the text quizzes, but that limits the information quite a bit. I think expecting the entire text would be an overwhelming activity. Expecting you to know and learn the information on your text quizzes, I think, is quite doable. Hopefully you'll agree. It looks like you're ready to begin our course. Our course is Lifespan Development, a psychology offering at our college, SCCC. It is PSY 222. It would be a different offering number at a different college. Perhaps you're in section 1 if it's a daytime class, or perhaps you're in section 71 or 72 if it's a nighttime class. It's good to know. You might be asked, for example, by the registrar sometime. I know that people in general, students in particular, sometimes like to skip the directions on things, but this is an important detail I wanted to share with you. You have two formats to choose from in terms of content. One is the one you're now using, the narrated lecture PowerPoints. For some students, though, the YouTube version that I've created might be a better fit. The YouTube version is the same material, but you can see the words at the bottom of the screen. So if you're an English language learner, for example, or you have certain challenges or disabilities in life, they might be a better option for you. Now, the only difficulty in using the YouTube version is that you can't click the links, so you would still have to go into the regular PowerPoints and access the links that are included. And in general, if I include a link, I'll put 1 or 2 questions in the lecture quiz based on them, and they often appear on the test. So if you do go with the YouTube version, make sure you do that important step. But I hope you'll find one of these 2 lecture choices to be a great fit for your listening and learning style. At SUNY Schenectady, we offer 3 developmental psychology courses: child psychology, adolescent psychology, and lifespan development. Of course, the one that you're now taking. Child psychology is a 4-credit course, particularly useful if you're going into the educational field, such as early childhood or kindergarten and grades 1 and 2. It's a 4-credit course and does require a classroom observation. Adolescent psychology would be great for people focusing on the adolescent age group. Although it's not considered to be a psychology course because it is not, we do offer a criminal justice course called juvenile delinquency. So if you're going to be working with teens, that would be a particularly good offering as well. For example, for a liberal arts elective or a general elective. And the lifespan course that you're now in, which looks at development from birth until death and everything in between. That symbol, if you're not familiar with it, is the psi, as in PSI, not SIGH. It's a letter of the Greek alphabet, and it's been adopted by the field of psychology to stand for psychology. It's a lot easier and quicker to write than the word psychology or even psych, so a friendly suggestion that if you haven't met it before, make friends with it and use it. It'll make your life easier. Let's now turn our attention to the 4 goals of psychology. The first one, describe, or description is perfectly fine. I think it's a simple concept, and yet years of teaching have told me, instructed me that it is not the case. So look at the picture there and write a brief description into your notes. If this was a non-virtual class, that is face-to-face, I would make that particular gesture in front of you and ask you to give me, again, a good description. So please describe what you see in that box. And you'll find that you may have a very good answer, or you may not even be in the remote ballpark. We'll have to see. So generally my answers fall in one of 2 categories, the correct and the not correct. Let's start with this example. Thumbs up. Other students might say, good job. Another student might say, left arm held out, fingers curled in, thumb pointing upwards. Well, clearly the thumbs up and good job is a very different sort of answer than the one with the fingers being curled and the thumb pointing upwards. The first 2 are not descriptions at all. They are interpretations. The last example with the fingers curled and thumbs up, that is a description. For example, if we went to every culture in the planet and were able to speak every language, the description would be the same. But the interpretation, which has nothing to do with the description, the interpretation which some of the students tried to give me would vary from culture to culture. So this could mean good job. That's one interpretation. It could mean thumbs up. If you're looking at somebody standing beside a vehicle with smoke coming out of it and they're doing this gesture, it probably means that they need a ride. Should you do this particular hand gesture in the Middle East? Definitely not. It's very similar to one of our hand gestures, one that you would not do in a classroom setting or even polite settings. I am told, based on a sheet, that if you do this in a German bar versus a Japanese bar, it will either get you 1 or 5 beers. I do not frequent either German or Japanese bars, so that'll be that. Consider a different example if you find this fun. Let's say that I shake my head left to right. Description would be head being moved left to right. But what would the interpretation be? Well, in our culture it would mean no. But in various cultures in the world, head going left to right means yes. So let's say that you're in a particular country and a person comes up to you and asks you, would you like to buy the services of a prostitute? You're shocked and vigorously shake your head left to right, meaning yes. And now you are now, unfortunately, haggling over a prostitution purchase. Probably not your intention. So again, description is the same. The interpretation, the explanation, that's a different step altogether. In terms of the answer to that very excellent question, which 2 are emphasized by developmental psychology? Since that's a text question, I'll refrain from answering it, but I will give you the sizable hint that will be found under the heading, Who Studies Human Development and Why? Which occurs very early in your Chapter 1 module. Hopefully that was helpful. Developmental psychology studies how we change across the lifespan in 3 distinct areas: physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. We offer a few developmental courses at the college. Child psychology is a 4-credit course designed especially for people that will be teaching toddlers or infants. Developmental psychology, Psych 222, studies development from before birth, in other words, prenatal development, through senescence, aging. We also have adolescent psychology, which is a great course for individuals that will be working with adolescents. If you are interested in working with adolescents, there is a criminal justice course called juvenile delinquency that also might be of great interest, even though it is not a developmental psychology course per se. Let's now meet the father of developmental psychology. You might be perhaps puzzled why there's 2 pictures here. It's because there's really no unified agreement amongst developmental psychologists who the father is. In fact, these 2 individuals come up the most often, but there's other individuals noted as well. In a previous slide, I had 4 different pictures and 4 different explanations. But since the summer course is 8 weeks and goes at a much quicker pace than a traditional 15-week full semester course, I decided to be kind to you, and I pulled out the other 2 individuals, Rousseau and Piaget, if you're interested, and we're just going to focus on these 2 individuals, learning just a little bit about them, and seeing who gets the honor, if that can be given to just one person. When you go to the next slide and see the group shot, see if you can identify one of these 2 individuals. I assume it's going to be a very easy task, but a more interesting task, look at the person to the left of center bottom and see if you can recognize him. He's probably the most famous person in psychology, or at least one of the top 2 in terms of being famous. So give it a try, and then you can listen to the narration and find out if you're right or not. Let's consider G. Stanley Hall, an early great American psychologist. He was the first president of the APA, American Psychological Association, that is. He invited Freud to lecture. It took a couple invitations, but Freud eventually came and lectured at Clark University. As trivia, he lectured in German, not because he lacked fluency in English. He was. In fact, Freud called English his favorite, quote-unquote, favorite foreign tongue. But at that time, the language of academia was German, not English. So his audience, at least the scholars, would have all been fluent in German as well. But to go back, I chose this hopefully interesting group picture. Look at the previous slide and see if you can identify G. Stanley Hall. I'll take a moment so you can actually do that. So if you're not visually challenged, that'd be easy. G. Stanley Hall would be the gentleman in the bottom middle. Do you recognize the 2 famous people of psychology to either side of him? On his left would be Sigmund Freud, and on his right would be Freud's most famous student, his protege, Carl Jung. Perhaps you encountered Carl Jung in Intro Psych, spelled J-U-N-G, of course. But to answer the question, was G. Stanley Hall the father of developmental psychology? No. He's more often credited as being the father of American developmental psychology, but not exactly the same thing. I should most definitely add before I move on that his area of study was adolescence. In fact, he pioneered the study of this particular area. So now let's consider Erik Erikson. I want to pose 3 questions for you to see what you remember from Intro Psych, assuming that you covered this theorist. Who was his famous mentor? How many stages were in his stage theory? And if you covered it, what was the name of the first stage? So who's his mentor? How many stages? And the name of stage 1. Erik Erikson was a psychodynamic theorist, student of the great Sigmund Freud. His stage theory is an 8-stage theory, which you indeed will need to learn for this course. And the name of stage 1, it was trust versus mistrust. So to answer our initial question, who is the father of developmental psychology? Although G. Stanley Hall is sometimes given the credit, he's more often given the credit for American developmental psychology. So that would leave us Erik Erikson being the theorist most likely to be given the credit of developmental psychology. So that would be our answer, especially if asked on a test or a quiz. I should mention that Paul Bathes left this world fairly recently, in 2016. So hopefully, now that you're clear on who is most likely to be identified as the father of developmental psychology, let's add to and refine that discussion to focus specifically on the type of developmental psychology you're enrolled in, that is, the lifespan approach, lifespan psychology, or lifespan development. And that individual, as you can see on this slide, would be Paul Bathes. So on this slide, we will note that particular construct and move on to the developmental principles that he emphasized in his particular theory, laying the groundwork for some, and we'll expand on these in Module 2, but let's take off. Let's begin our discussion of the basic issues of development. I will say that sometimes I'll use the word issues, or other times I might use the word perspectives or principles. So as not to confuse you, please consider them to be interchangeable terms. Depending on the author of the textbook or even the theorist, those words will be used interchangeably. So issue, same thing as perspective in this context, and same thing as principle. But let's start with the one that I've ordered first. Development is lifelong. Now this might seem intuitively obvious to you, but it is a major foundational principle of developmental psychology. We will add on to a sub-perspective of it. Is that lifelong development equally across the lifespan or not? The title of this would suggest it is, whereas we'll meet other theorists who really emphasized everything occurring prior to puberty. We'll also learn, starting on the next slide, that within this topic, there's a perspective of, is it a stage nature of development, or is it continuous and non-stage? But that will be fully answered, I hope, in Module 2. Now, as we learned on the previous slide, development is lifelong, but again, some theorists believe it has distinct stages, other theorists emphasize more continuous flow. So that's a little bit foundational knowledge, and we'll actually talk about specific theorists in Module 2. Another basic issue of development is there one course of development or are there many? One course would suggest that all children follow a very similar path. Many would suggest that there are distinct paths that would be influenced by the unique combination of genetics and environment experienced by the child. Your textbook gives the example of the parenting style of the Ache Native Americans of South America and Paraguay. The forest environment is dangerous, things that we can put in the baby's mouth, wildlife that could be dangerous, spiders, snakes, and so on. So the Ache mothers will carry the infants upon their body for 2 years. So at 2 years, the Ache baby's motor ability is quite comparable to an American's ability at 1 year of age. that should, if there's one course of development, produce very different developmental outcomes. The Ache baby should not have the same degree of competence and motor skills that an American baby would have. But that is hardly the case. Ache children, for example, at 9, are far ahead of American children, suggesting in fact that there are many courses of development. In a different example, I gave you a picture of Native American parents, a Native American woman with her infant in a cradle board on her back. Same idea. In Native American culture and many cultures, people are nomadic and moving and cannot place the baby in a playpen or a crib, so the baby is much safer on the back. Although the babies will initially lag behind in motor skills, they will rapidly catch up to children in cultures that were allowed more free movement. I thought it might be interesting to show you what the Ache people look like. On the left-hand side, you see Ache ceremonial makeup, which you would probably not see unless you were at a festival. If you visit the Ache, you'll probably more see a scene on the right. That crowd of people is rooting for their children at a soccer tournament. So far, we've discussed a few basic themes of developmental psychology. Is development continuous or discontinuous? Is there one path or many? Another basic issue is that of stability versus plasticity. Stability means that the differences that we're born with persist across the entire lifespan. The other alternative viewpoint would be plasticity. Now, perhaps you learned plasticity in intro psych and learned it as the neuron's ability to recover after damage, or perhaps the context was in a learning chapter. The neurons will modify after learning, such as the shape of the synapses and the dendrites and so on. Well, that's another way of looking at plasticity, perfectly acceptable for those areas. But within our course, it'll refer to that there'll be not only the stability that we mentioned, but there's also considerable change. And development can be impacted by all sorts of influences, whether it's environmental toxicities, stress, trauma, learning, proper nutrition, disease, 1,000 different things. So seeing that outcome is being shaped and influenced and modified as we progress through life. Now you might say, which one is it? Well, it is a combination of each. Some characteristics show moderate stability, but for most characteristics there is a moderate degree of plasticity also. So a person's personality style from early childhood might persist as an adult, but maybe the very shy child might learn the skills to take on certain traits of an extrovert, such as they might be a shy person, but might do a career in theater or acting, for example, in which they have to learn to display their emotions and maybe even contrive their emotions. I thought this picture was very interesting, showing the individual as a teen and then as a person in their 20s, the dog as a puppy in the first picture, and a geriatric doggy in the later picture. Let's consider our next issue or perspective or principle of development, that of development as being multidimensional. Now, when you see the word multidimensional in your text, or perhaps on a quiz or test, or in another course, translate the word multidimensional, if it's in a developmental course, as meaning that the development is going to occur over 3 distinct domains. Now, this is not to say that one domain can't influence each other, but the domains are distinct. Physical development, a major emphasis of this course. Cognitive development, in other words, thought, thinking, mental processes, a major emphasis of this course. And the last one, socio-emotional, or social/emotional development. Other textbooks, teachers, researchers might, instead of using the term socio-emotional or the more laborious emotional social as psychosocial. So consider psychosocial and the other two terms, particularly socio-emotional, to be totally interchangeable. Let's consider our next issue, that development is multidirectional. So development is dynamic, it is not linear, so in some areas there might be rapid gain, others might be holding stagnant, some might actually go backwards. For example, maybe a child is under great stress, maybe the birth of a sibling, they're firstborn, they used to get all the attention, now they're being somewhat ignored accidentally. So socio-emotionally, they might go into a state of regression, thumb sucking when they haven't done that for years, or bedwetting when they haven't done that for years. So going backwards socio-emotionally, but intellectually maybe not declining, and maybe they're undergoing a growth spurt. So it's not all going forward or all going backwards or staying the same, but at very different paces. The field of lifespan psychology is scientific, applied, and interdisciplinary. Scientific meaning it's one of the sciences. You might ponder what type. Hopefully you know it's not a basic science or natural science, but we use the term social science, or if you prefer, behavioral science. Applied meaning we not only want knowledge for the sake of knowledge, in other words, basic science, but we also want to apply what we learn. So it's also an applied science as well as a basic science. And it's interdisciplinary. So your text draws information from education, from cognitive disciplines, from neuropsychology, and many other disciplines. So interdisciplinary, drawing from the wealth of educational resources. So let's look at its major themes. I personally have a little bit of a problem saying that development is multidisciplinary. It's not. The field is multidisciplinary. It's a social science of psychology, but impacted by many other disciplines. But since your textbook chose to list it as such, we will. But no, it's really talking about the field, not the individual's development. Your development or my development is not scientific, for example. I think you get the point. Obviously, development isn't the interplay between biology and environment. This slide focuses on environment. Environmental forces obviously include family, SES, which is discussed in the next slide, poverty or the opposite, affluence, neighborhoods, schools, and cultural context. SES is probably a term that you've crossed paths with many times, but if not, it stands for socioeconomic status. Loosely translates informally as class. It's an index that looks at your number of years of education, the prestige of your job, and your income. Should you wish to calculate it, you can visit the website attached. Let's examine the principle and context from both these in a little bit more detail. There are three systems of contextual influences. They have no particular order, but let's start with the normative age-graded events, then we'll consider non-normative events, and then normative history-graded events. For the first one, the normative age-graded events, there are things that happen to many individuals of a given culture at a certain age, hence the age-graded. It can be related to a biological event, or it can be something that's typically undertaken at that culture at a particular time. So for example, going to kindergarten at age 5. Maybe a girl's first menstruation around age 11 or 12, though sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but those would be two good examples. Non-normative events that we wouldn't necessarily experience or expect to experience. So It could be having one's college shut down. It could be a parent losing a job, or a parent being deployed overseas. It could be being diagnosed with cancer at a young age. Normative history grade events are historical events that impact a generation. For example, you have probably participated in active shooter drills. When I was in elementary school, we would do duck and cover under the desk in case of a nuclear attack. So normative history grade, think of people growing up in the Great Depression. Nothing was thrown away. We're losing this generation right now on rapid numbers. My father's part of this generation. Perhaps people that grew up when cars were introduced, maybe people who grew up when internet was first introduced, people who grew up, or people of a certain age when cell phones. So this is impacting people of a given culture in a particular niche in history. If you're comfortable with this, go and consider the 4 examples on the bottom and identify them. So let's see how you did. Prenatal development, probably the easiest one, from conception until birth. Infancy and toddlerhood, well, that would be from birth then to age 2. Early childhood then, from 2 to 6. Middle childhood would be then from 6 until puberty. Adolescence, adolescent to 18. And within the last few years, the term emerging or emergent adulthood has become fixed in the field. Before it was hit or miss. So now that we have emerging or emergent adulthood, that would be 18 to 25 years. That means early adulthood would begin at age 25, but when would a person no longer be an early adult? When would a person move on to middle adulthood? I would suspect a lot of you had some number in the 30s, and you are way off. It would be from 25 to 40, or even 45. So that means middle adulthood would be 45, but when would it end? This, I believe, will surprise most of you. 60 or even 65, depending on the theorist. So yes, a person that's 64, 62, by many, many theorists would be considered a middle adulthood. Now, you might consider that to be late adulthood, but we had the changes. If you consider the turn of the century, that is from between 1899 to 1900, the average person died at about age 50. Currently, American lifespan is 78, so obviously we've had to push back some of these ages. That would be late adulthood, would be 60 or 65, depending on the theorist, until their passing. So how did you do? So prenatal development, probably pretty easy from conception, and that is when the sperm and egg cell unite, until birth. Infancy and toddlerhood, from birth to 2, or sometimes they'll list 2.5 years. I went with 2 to make your life easier. Early childhood, usually given the age range of 2 to 6 years. Middle child, usually from 6 to puberty, obviously variable between individuals, cultures, and even the sexes. Adolescence, puberty to 19 years. Early adulthood, most sources will agree from 20, but no unanimous agreement whether it should end at age 40 or 45. When people died around age 50 at the turn of the century, that is between the 1900 and 1899, right at that point, 50 was the average age, so maybe 40 would have been a rather late estimate of it, but with our current lifespan, maybe 45 is a better age range, but either one we should know. So 20 to 40 or 20 to 45. Middle adulthood then would be either to 40 to 45 or 60 to 65. And late adulthood, 60 and older or 65 and older. As we go on later in the course, we'll see that there are several divisions within late adulthood as well. I created these concepts check slides as a study tool so that you'll know that you know the material before the test. Students sadly often realize that they don't know the material on the test, which is kind of too late to do anything. So anyway, again, try it without looking at it and then keep doing it until you have a level of proficiency. So let's start. Lay the foundation for developmental psychology. Well, that would be Rousseau. That's probably the easiest one. Seen as the father of developmental psychology for most child development theorists, probably also an easier one, Jean Piaget, our Swiss theorist. The father of developmental psychology for most psychodynamic theorists, that would be the student of Sigmund Freud, that would be Erik Erikson. Next, seen as the father of specifically the lifespan approach to developmental psychology, that would be Paul Baltes. And last one, seen as the father to American developmental psychology, but much less often for the entire field, well, that would be our G. Stanley Hall, the gentleman that invited Sigmund Freud to our country. I should share he was very impressed by our Adirondacks, according to what was written. Here's one other review slide from Module 1. Do you recognize these three gentlemen? Take a moment and see if you can. The name, that is. On our left, we have G. Stanley Hall. He was born in the mid-1800s and died in the mid-1920s. If you're an exact date person, 1848 to 1924. Jean Piaget, Swiss researcher focusing on children's cognition, as I'm sure you know. He was born just before 1900 and died in exactly the year 1980. And Paul Baltes, born in the mid-1930s and died fairly recently, as I mentioned before, in 2006.